Hi, everyone. Christiana Huber with C2ES is here. I think we're going to get started now. So welcome to the webinar titled Making Sense of the Cost of Climate Change. I'm the moderator today, and we are really looking forward to this webinar. We're so glad that you, our participants, and also our presenters could join this afternoon. So I'm going to kick us off with a quick introduction to C2ES's Resilience Program and the purpose of the webinar, and then we'll get straight into our presentations. So C2ES is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to forge practical solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, expand clean energy, and strengthen resilience to climate impacts. We bring city, state, and national policymakers together with businesses and other stakeholders to discuss these issues, as we have today. Last fall, C2ES and the U.S. Conference of Mayors partnered on this report, Mayors Leading the Way on Climate. The report surveys America's large cities to provide a snapshot of climate action and concerns at the city level. One of the questions was about how cities are experiencing climate impacts. And among the over 150 respondents, 95% reported changing conditions that could be related to climate change in the survey. I know this is not based on actual attribution, it's just a measure of cities' perceptions of these risks. But you see that a majority of the respondents reported more intense or frequent heavy precipitation or flooding, heat waves, and drought. And then we also work with companies that are concerned about these impacts as well. In 2013 and 2015, C2ES released these Weathering the Storm and Weathering the Next Storm reports, which looked at financial disclosures of 100 companies. Those were the S&P 100 in 2011 and 2012. We found a consistent uptick in the number of companies mentioning physical climate risk in their reports. Companies are concerned about shipping, their facilities, rising energy costs, and the health of their employees. So in our first report, 90 out of 100 companies mentioned physical risk in at least one of these three different kinds of financial disclosures. We looked at CDP surveys, financial reports, including SEC filings and annual reports, and sustainability reports. That went up to 91 out of 100 in our 2015 report, which looked at fiscal year 2013. And last year, in our 2018 update, we looked at fiscal year 2016 and found 96 out of 98 companies mentioned physical risks somewhere in these three documents. So we know this issue is definitely on the companies that we work with and the cities that we work with's minds. Last fall, with the release of the second volume of the fourth National Climate Assessment, climate costs made mainstream headlines. And just last month, NOAA released its tally for the cost of extreme weather, or events that cost more than $1 billion. You've probably seen this map that's on the screen, but it shows the 14 separate events that cost greater than $1 billion in 2018, which added up to 91 billion. These are not necessarily climate costs, but are rather the cost of extreme weather. And this growing number of events or growing likelihood of some of these events is attributed to climate change. So given these broad concerns and the reporting of the climate change price tag, we have 4 presenters today that can help explain these estimates and describe these anticipated costs. Our first presenter will be Dr. Brenda Ekwurzel, a senior climate scientist and the director of climate science for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She makes sure that the Climate and Energy Program's analyses reflect climate science and researches the influence of major carbon producers on rising global average temperatures and sea level. She is a co-author of the 4th National Climate Assessment and will accordingly be overviewing the report's findings about climate costs and how they can be reduced or avoided through climate mitigation and adaptation. We will next hear from Jeff Tucker, an analyst on the economic research team at Zillow Research. He studies the causes and consequences of changing supply in the housing market, and he will be telling us about how real estate is threatened by sea level rise and share some policy interventions. Our final presentation will come from Ben Cohen and Amanda Hallauer. Ben is a director at Quantified Ventures, an impact investing advisory firm, He heads much of Quantified Ventures resilience work, including having worked with the first ever publicly issued environmental impact bond with Atlanta. And Amanda's a watershed manager in Atlanta's Department of Watershed Management. She's responsible for advancing plans, policies, and projects involving green infrastructure as part of the Department of Watershed Management's Stormwater Management Program. Together, they will discuss how to use this understanding of risk and potential damages to inform and finance resilience action. A note that all of our participants will be muted through the webinar, but we'll be taking questions in the chat box in your GoToWebinar window. As you have questions, please type them in that box, and we're leaving a full 30 minutes for questions, so please don't be shy. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brenda to talk about the National Climate Assessment and the cost estimates in that report.
Thank you, Christiane, and I really appreciate your roundup of the several multi-billion-dollar costs just in the recent time period, which is exactly what we're going to turn to right now, is reducing risk through emissions mitigation and adaptation. And primarily, I'm going to focus on the fourth National Climate Assessment, and then briefly on recent implications from the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So right now we're in a 1 degree C world. Let's review the state of climate change thus far. So human-induced warming, you'll see in the next click how that has approximately reached 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels in the year 2017. And let's see what this has caused consequences. You've all seen recent images of disasters. Hurricanes are becoming more powerful and deadly because of rising ocean temperatures, and people are paying the price. Shown here is Hurricane Harvey, which struck Houston, and the National Guard was called in to rescue people from their homes. And scientists found that global warming made such an event around 3 times more likely. In Puerto Rico, people struggled to find even basic provisions like water after Hurricane Maria. And in California, climate change contributed to turning forests into kindling. Here's a community charred after the recent wildfires in the state. Extreme heat waves are so severe in places that many people are already struggling to survive them. So here's an example of a 1 degree C world. This is what happened in 2011. There was extreme flooding in Thailand, and it was a situation that affected U.S. business interests. You know, the interconnected businesses of Western Digital, it's a US-based company that produced most of the hard drives in Thailand. And so they suffered nearly $200 million in losses, and we had lost half of fewer drives in 2011. This shortage was temporary. It doubled the global hard drive prices, and consumers may not have been aware, but that affected prices in the US-based Apple, HP, and Dell. So this is just one of those examples of the interconnected influence of climate change disruptions on one side of the world can influence the economy. As we mentioned, human-induced warming reached approximately 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels in 2017. At the present rate, global temperatures would reach 1.5 degrees around the year 2040. Could be as soon as the next decade or happen by 2050. And 2 degrees Celsius around 2065. So the question we have is a choice to slow down the change, to stay within the limits of the Paris Climate Agreement, or if we choose to embark upon a current trajectory and continue on a higher emissions path that would cause damages to the US economy, and how does that compare to damages if we invest in a lower emissions path? And this same question could be asked for other economies, other countries all around the world. So mitigation-related activities in the United States is part of the answer to that choice. Already, they're taking places in every state, at the federal, also at local levels. We have over 455 cities have taken action, and this has continued to grow. And there are many different types of actions, a portfolio of solutions that states and cities and businesses have pursued or deepened initiatives aimed at reducing emissions. And you can see that what's shown here are the 50 states. We also have evidence, information that was reported in the table regarding Puerto Rico and other U.S. interests. So in the absence of more significant global mitigation efforts, climate change is projected to impose substantial damages on the U.S. economy. Even though we are taking steps, it's not yet at the scale that could avoid damages to the U.S. economy. For example, shown here are projected changes in energy expenditures. Now let's now turn to the costs of human health. Shown here is a study of 49 U.S. cities. A low emissions pathway, we save more lives compared to a higher emissions pathway. It also has damages to the environment. Shown here are average projected changes in fishery catches along North American coastlines. Next slide on showing the impacts to the environment. I guess that's not showing yet, but thank you. Okay, under scenarios with high emissions and limited or no adaptation, annual losses in some sectors, we're switching now to the table, are estimated to grow to hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the century. These can be in areas of shellfish, agriculture, coral reefs, freshwater fish, winter recreation, electricity supply and demand, flooding on the inland rivers, urban drainage, rails, and so forth. But I'm going to switch now and talk about the difference in these pathways. First, I'm going to go to the pathways of the top 3 sectors. So we can avoid much of these damages if the world does not choose to embark on the high emissions path, this dark colored red line of the RCP 8.5, and instead chooses a lower scenario, that middle line that is RCP 4.5, or even lower, which is closer to the Paris Climate Agreement. So let's see how this works for the top 3 sectors of the table I just showed you. By 2090, under the high emissions path, the average damages in the labor sector are projected to be around $115 billion per year in 2015 dollars. And note that this is a range of around 87 to 221 billion. But if we look at that average number, next click, we can avoid nearly half of those damages under a low emission scenario. By 2090, under the high emissions path, average damages and extreme temperature mortality are projected to be around $141 billion per year, with a range of 80 to 200 billion in 2015 dollars. However, if we choose the lower emissions pathway, we could avoid nearly 60% of those damages under a low emissions scenario. Also, by 2090, under the high emissions path, the average damages and extreme temperature mortality are projected to be around $118 billion per year. However, we can avoid over 20% of those damages under the low emissions scenario. And remember, these costs assume no additional adaptation. Hence, we can reduce these damages even further with adaptation. So does this sound reasonable? Let's compare with one study that found nationwide 85% of U.S. homes worth over $780 billion could be spared under a low sea level rise scenario. And to explore some of these concepts yourself, you can check out an interactive map and zoom down to a state, community, or zip code level. So local information combines national climate assessment sea level rise projections from NOAA with local digital elevation models that the Union of Concerned Scientists combined with information provided by Zillow. And you're going to hear more about another study using Zillow information as well next. And so that will be very interesting. The main point is that the costs that we're talking about towards the end of the century and that are directly attributed to climate change are not unreasonable. So now remember that these estimates for reducing risks were primarily through emissions reductions. So for example, electrification of end use and powering those end use by renewable energy, low emission type of scenarios, deep decarbonization. We can lower those risks even further through adaptation. In cases such as sea level rise, early investments in adaptation dramatically reduce the scale of the economic impact. Let's look at this figure from Chapter 8 of the Fourth National Climate Assessment. Look at the costs without adaptation for the coastal sector. Cumulative costs are rising to around over $3.5 trillion by the end of the century without adaptation under the high or low scenario. However, with adaptation, we could keep those costs to under $1 trillion. Now, the effect of near-term emissions mitigation on reducing risk is expected to become apparent by mid-century and grow substantially thereafter. Again, you see those scenarios of emissions that we've seen before, and to the right, you see this relationship. By the warmer the temperature change we have globally, the greater percent of U.S. gross domestic product is affected. So the direct damage to the U.S. economy from global emissions that increase the global mean surface temperature directly are against our own self-interest. Another thing is that interactions between mitigation and adaptation are complex and can lead to benefits, but they also have potential for adverse consequences. So for example, you might build up infrastructure or nature-based solutions for one community, and you may shove the water towards another community and have increased exposure for another community. So finding equitable solutions as we're solving and adapting, reducing emissions and adapting to climate change are going to be key. Some of the interactions between mitigation and adaptation are complex and can lead to benefits. And here's an example of reducing exposure to vulnerability of climate change into salinization in Texas. We can put desal plants and help provide clean water to the citizens and residents of Texas. Now, the complementarity is especially important given that a certain degree of climate change due to past and present emissions is unavoidable, and this especially is the case with coastal property damages. So if you want to learn more about this, check out our mitigation chapter of the Fourth National Climate Assessment, or check out the entire report with the large URL at the bottom. So thank you so much, and now I will hand it over to Jeff.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brenda. That was just a wonderful overview of the Fourth National Climate Assessment. And so, yeah, like Brenda said, I'll be drilling down a bit more in particular on the coastal real estate threatened by rising seas. And so this project arose out of a collaboration with Climate Central, who contacted us and asked to essentially work with us to estimate that. So yeah, we can just dive right in to the slides. So as was, I think, clear from Brenda's overview here, residential real estate is, it's one of the biggest components of national wealth. The total value in the US is $32 trillion. So right now that's over 1.5 times GDP. This is going to interact with housing, both through the need for greater cooling, especially in southern states. It's really going to reshape the geography of demand for housing. We've seen growing wildfire risk at the urban forest interface in California, but also in other western states. And then, of course, rising seas are going to begin flooding a lot of coastal areas much more frequently. So that is our focus here, and it's really an exceptionally clear risk because we can model these effects under the different representative concentration pathways that Brenda already introduced, and consider when exactly flooding will reach different areas of the United States. So Climate Central has produced these incredibly detailed interactive maps. Again, this is a sort of similar project to the one the Union of Concerned Scientists did, and just another sort of angle of attack to understand this problem. So after the webinar, I can share links to those, but I'll give some examples of how these maps look. So this is a map of Norfolk, Virginia, you know, a port town in Virginia, and going to be on the front lines. It already is on the front lines of some, tidal flooding arising, becoming more frequent due to climate change. And so this is, in some ways, a conservative model of sea level rise. Climate Central is using a so-called bathtub model. So it's actually, throughout the presentation, this isn't actually going to be accounting for, it's not trying to account for infrequent severe events like the high winds and rain coming with a big storm. So this is really just sea level rise plus expected annual flooding. So those are the incredibly common events, unlike 100-year floods. So this is how it looks in Norfolk. And then what we wanted to do is go in and estimate the value of these properties at risk. So on the next slide, I think we've got a sort of essentially just an overlay of the property values here. Another location. So this is Grays Harbor County, Washington. That's the town of Aberdeen. This is sort of an unusually low elevation coastal town for Washington because it's sort of on alluvial territory there, the mouth of the Chehalis River. So these are the areas that will be flooded in the RCP 8.5 sort of unchecked pollution scenario, as they refer to it. And this is also incorporating the dynamics of Antarctic ice shelves beginning to break off. And so that was based on the paper by Kopp and co-authors in 2017 that's cited also in the 4th National Climate Assessment. So this is what these maps, the blue area is what will be inundated on an annual basis by 2100. So as you can see in some of these towns, it's really a tremendous amount of territory. So this is where Zillow comes in. We've got the most comprehensive database of US home attributes and locations. And you may have heard of our branded home valuation algorithm called the Zestimate. And so that was what we were able to provide in a partnership with Climate Central, was to go through and provide over 100 million homes and their values and some attributes to Climate Central to then essentially just combine that with these maps of risk zones and consider under the different scenarios exactly which homes down to the individual house level will be flooded or at risk of flooding and how much they're actually worth right now. So the other sort of unique aspect of that is not just using tax assessed values, because tax assessments often don't reflect current market value, and also trying to just get past using current sale prices because that composition changes year to year. So the result is that we sort of summed this up looking at different representative concentration pathways and then essentially just overlaid them on these maps. So here we're seeing sort of aggregated to the acreage level, the home value at risk. And this is just residential real estate in Norfolk, Virginia. So you can see there's also some commercial property and industrial property along the coast, especially in these port towns that we're not even considering. So that's another way in which this will be a conservative estimate of the value at risk. If we turn to Aberdeen, we can see the total value at risk throughout that town. Again, these are just millions of dollars across several acres likely to be flooded by 2100 in the event of sort of our continued unchecked emissions. So the big picture, when we add that all up, we're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. And like Brenda said, a lot of that is unavoidable at this point. The RCP 2.6 concentration pathway is at this point almost just a stake in the ground to represent what is the best that could almost physically be done anymore. I think the RCP 4.5 is more like what could be done with great political will, and the RCP 8.5 is sort of business as usual, continuing on the path we're on now. So the total home value in that final scenario at risk is $1.3 trillion worth, just estimated at 2018 home values. So we look at where exactly that will be. A tremendous amount of these homes are in Florida. So that's another great thing about this project is you can break down the expected damages to pretty granular geography. You can look at states, cities, counties, and just if you're a city manager, you can zoom in on the map and see very clearly what's at risk, how much it's worth, et cetera. So Florida alone would bear 2/5 of the flooding risk by 2100 on the sort of business as usual pathway. And in fact, within Florida, it's quite concentrated as well. It's essentially over half of those homes are in Miami-Dade and Broward counties. So again, the potential, if we can have effective mitigation in those cities, effective flood walls and protection, it could be extremely cost effective to focus the efforts there. And so just for further context, this is all a lower bound, in part because we're just using present values of homes, but also the present number of homes. And we know more homes are built every year in coastal areas at risk. Florida, for instance, has added over 10,000 homes, at least that we know of, just since 2010 that will likely flood by 2100. That's another $15 billion worth of homes being built just in the last several years. So if we continue on, if we were to sort of project out the continued construction of homes in risky areas, the 2100 totals will be dramatically higher, in fact. New Jersey is another state that has built a ton of new homes in at-risk areas. There's been especially rebuilding after Hurricane Sandy on areas that are just going to be more and more frequently flooded. So turning to economists' sort of policy considerations about this. Right now, the National Flood Insurance Program is the sort of main federal program bearing the brunt of the costs of rising seas because it is dealing with claims paid out to homeowners whose homes are damaged in floods. There are several shortcomings with the NFIP. If you're boiling it down, the biggest problem is that the claims paid out are exceeding the amount collected in premiums. They required a large bailout of billions of dollars in 2017, and the new debt they've issued is rated unlikely to be repaid in full just by premiums. So economists are not sort of thrilled with the current policy. I think the biggest risk is the moral hazard risk of when you insure a risky choice or a risky house location, you're incentivizing people continuing to live there, continuing to develop there. And in fact, claims are quite often literally used to, when they're paid out, they're literally used to rebuild in exactly the same place. This is also, I think it's easy to imagine, and it's certainly true that there are many people of modest means living in coastal areas. But in fact, when we look at flood insurance claims, most of them are paid out to owners of above median home value homes. So there's a very regressive aspect to the transfers in this program. So we have a sort of quarterly survey we do of about 100 housing economists. And on our last edition of this, we asked them sort of what they think about current policies and what they think we ought to do. So hope you can actually read it. I know it's a lot of text, but the economists are pretty split on whether insurance ought to be mandated. The broadest agreement we've found in the way this question was framed to folks was that the government should not be underwriting or subsidizing property loss insurance in high-risk areas. And then just a lot of disagreement of sort of whether they should impose more mandates. That was sort of poo-pooed by respondents. It's just a thorny issue of how exactly to deal with folks currently living there. If we flip to the next question, we sort of pressed economists on, well, what should be done about folks who can't afford insurance if it were actually priced to be actuarially fair, so that it was actually premiums actually covering the expected losses. And so the most common response was economists essentially avoided answering this question. You can see about 45% of people just chose none of the above, essentially. But the most common sort of proactive response was, well, tough luck. So this was a fairly sort of callous economic response that basically, if the costs of living there are not worth it or not affordable, folks just shouldn't live there. Or they could, a couple other sort of options there. Looking forward, when we asked what would economists actually sort of support, the most common sort of suggestions were to essentially stop increasing the number of homes at risk, either by a moratorium on construction in the areas we know are going to flood, or to impose stricter building codes, just requiring absolutely state-of-the-art resilience, of having homes elevated off the ground on concrete, reinforced against high wind, that sort of a thing. So we essentially asked the economists to rank these 5 choices and then added up those ranks to get this chart. So the takeaway is that, from my perspective about what housing economists have to say here, is that there's just a tremendous amount of risk in coastal areas that we're just not dealing with adequately right now. And I think there's a lot of room for productive mitigation and potentially relocation programs, but it's just going to remain a really politically thorny issue. So with that, I think I can hand it off to Amanda and Ben.
Great. Yeah, so we've heard a lot about the costs of climate change. I'm going to hopefully try to put a little bit more positive spin on it, talking about a financing approach that can use some of the data out there on climate impacts and use it in a way that helps cities and states and businesses and other stakeholders optimize spending on projects that can actually help build resilience to those impacts. So again, I'm Ben Cohen with Quantified Ventures. We're an impact investment intermediary firm that specializes in structuring outcomes-based financing, notably environmental and social impact bonds. And I lead our urban and coastal resilience practice, which comprises a lot of projects for urban green infrastructure, including the environmental impact bond that we just closed about a month ago with Amanda and the City of Atlanta Department of Watershed Management that you'll hear more about, that will finance 6 green infrastructure projects in the Proctor Creek watershed. We also are doing work in forestry and land use and sustainable agriculture within the environmental space, and we also have a health and social impact team. So the next slide just shows the general model of what an environmental impact bond is. So it essentially acts like a normal bond or loan or any other form of debt where there's a set interest rate that's paid over time. There's upfront capital that's provided by investors to the issuer, which typically we work with city and state governments. Corporates could also play this role. But in addition to that set interest rate, there's also an additional performance payment mechanism that's made based on how successful the projects that are being financed are at actually achieving what the environmental or social or economic or other kinds of outcomes are that were the goals for the project. And that can, the structure can take a form of different ways. Typically, if the projects perform better than expected in terms of achieving those desired outcomes, there's an additional performance payment that's made from the issuers to the investors, but that's compensated by either a lower base interest rate or the potential for a payment made the other way, essentially investors subsidizing the issuers in the case of underperformance. And that may seem a little bit illogical at first, but it's for having the issuers pay for higher than expected performance, but it's based in really an economic logic of more outcomes, more gallons of stormwater managed translates into higher impacts and higher economic benefits to the public or private entities, that's the issuer. or the payer of these bonds. So why would cities or states or corporates use this environmental impact bond approach as opposed to more traditional bonding? And it's really based, or what these EIBs allow issuers to do is to hedge some of the uncertainty around how projects, particularly innovative projects and nature-based solutions, to hedge the uncertainty that those projects will perform as they are intended, and shifting that risk to investors. And it's also a way to internalize and monetize positive environmental or social externalities that may not be reflected in current capital spending. So this allows issuers to test new innovative kinds of projects, access new sources of capital, and tap into the growing impact investing market. They share in the benefits with investors, but it can also make the public spending more efficient if they're paying based on the end outcomes that these entities actually desire rather than for the projects themselves. And it can help them understand better what is the actual impact that's generated by these projects. And that would then help them inform future planning and access future funding for this kind of work. And the investors care because a growing number of investors are looking for investments that tie environmental and social performance to their financial returns, as well as a greater number of impact deals. So two of the biggest hurdles that impact investors frequently cite are measurable outcomes and actual pipeline of deal flow. So we believe that this kind of financing can help solve for those two problems. In addition, typically the investors we work with are fixed income municipal debt investors. And because the performance of these bonds and the financial return is linked to environmental performance of these projects, it's a different risk profile than just the credit rating of a municipal issuer or some of these other macroeconomic factors in a fixed income portfolio. So the next slide goes over, why are we in this webinar and where are we talking about this? And really it's because central to any environmental impact bond or any form of outcomes-based financing, it's really rooted in this economic logic and an understanding of, given these projected costs in these areas that we're working in, how do you then translate projects that can mitigate that impact? How do you translate a gallon of stormwater managed to a dollar amount of avoided costs and avoided impact based on some of the studies that you've heard already? And it's also, as part of any form of outcomes-based financing, there's an evaluation methodology that's fundamental to assessing how that performance payment is made. So it's a way to gather new data and actually evaluate the outcomes from some of these projects like green infrastructure. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amanda from the Atlanta Department of Watershed Management to talk about the work that we've done together and the projects that are being financed there.
Great, thank you, Ben. Hello, and as Ben mentioned, I'm with the City of Atlanta's Department of Watershed Management. My name is Amanda Hallauer, and I'm in the Office of Watershed Protection. The Department of Watershed Management is the drinking water and wastewater utility for the City of Atlanta, serving 1.2 million customers. We are also responsible for watershed protection for the stewardship of our natural waterways, and as such, for stormwater management. So moving to the next slide, stormwater is a challenge citywide. The high volumes and velocities of stormwater runoff lead to local flooding. Localized street flooding leads to infrastructure damage, as well as erosion, sedimentation, and polluted streams. And in the next slide, you can see how urbanization really contributes to stormwater issues. Atlanta has experienced rapid growth over recent decades, which is projected to continue in coming decades. The development replaces the soils with impervious surfaces, such as rooftops and roads, that increases stormwater that goes directly into our pipes and local streams that can become overwhelmed and often do in large storms. And further, due to climate change, Atlanta has been experiencing more frequent and more severe storms. We've had at least 2 100-year storm events since 2009 that caused widespread damage to the city. The 10-year storm is happening every 2 to 3 years now. And 2018 was the second wettest year on record for North Georgia. However, despite a $25 million estimated annual need for stormwater operations and maintenance and $500 million in identified watershed improvement capital projects by our department, the City of Atlanta has no dedicated source of funding to meet those stormwater management needs. And then furthermore, the next slide, while stormwater issues are experienced throughout the city, they also disproportionately impact certain more vulnerable communities. One of those is located in the upper Proctor Creek watershed, where there's a number of neighborhoods just downtown, or just downstream of downtown Atlanta. Proctor Creek begins within the highly urbanized downtown area. It is actually buried underground at that point, beneath many impervious surfaces that prevent infiltration and cause all of the runoff to flow directly to the neighborhoods that lie just downstream. And the creek itself, Proctor Creek, which was, once a healthy community asset, is currently one of the most impaired streams in the region due to high bacteria levels, erosion, illegal dumping. The surrounding neighborhoods, many of which are economically distressed, there's high unemployment, vacant houses. They also face public health threats due to regular flooding, brownfields, lack of green space. And so, as you can see here, there is enormous need for restoration in the Proctor Creek watershed alone, with over $100 million identified for watershed improvement projects. So, next slide. Atlanta is a member of the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities Network. And it's clearly, stormwater is a resilience issue among others for the city. Our Resilient Atlanta Plan, which is what we called our resilience strategy, it actually identifies comprehensive stormwater management as significant need to be addressed and funded, particularly in the face of climate change, and also with a focus on equity. Furthermore, the city is committed to the use of green infrastructure as a key strategy for tackling this need. Green infrastructure incorporates natural vegetation into engineered systems to either restore or replicate the natural hydrology of undeveloped land, reduce the volume of polluted runoff from entering streams and pipe systems. It also has the added advantage of multiple co-benefits, which could include enhancing communities and beautifying communities, spurring economic development, providing wildlife habitat, improving air quality, and easing urban heat. And in 2017, Atlanta City Council actually approved a Green Infrastructure Strategic Action Plan. This came out of a multi-agency task force that was led by Department of Watershed, and that promotes the use of GI green infrastructure across departments, and sets a goal of 225 million gallons of runoff, of annual runoff reduction through the use of green infrastructure. However, moving on, as in many municipalities, we are challenged, as I mentioned, by a lack of adequate funding for our stormwater management program and green infrastructure program, since we do not have a stormwater utility fee that can provide that dedicated source. That means we have to come up with other ways. And so one way we're implementing green infrastructure to meet the goal of the Strategic Action Plan is on private property through a progressive post-development stormwater ordinance that we passed in 2013. It requires the installation of green infrastructure to manage stormwater on all new residential and commercial development, as well as infill redevelopment, to reduce runoff through redevelopment of areas that were built prior to stormwater controls. So we have permitted over 4,300 green infrastructure projects throughout the city since February 2013. But as you can see on the map on the right, Most of the development has been happening in the north and east of the city, parts of the city, which means that these projects haven't been equitably distributed throughout the city. So that means we need to come up with other ways to address the underserved areas, such as Proctor Creek Watershed. We need to leverage partnerships and look for creative alternative sources of funding. You can see, and then so you can see the red circle on the map there is actually indicates the area in the upper Proctor Creek Watershed where we are targeting, where we're going to be implementing green infrastructure projects to be financed by the recently issued environmental impact bond that Ben just talked about. Our EIB opportunity came about through our partnership, the next slide, through our partnership with the 100 Resilient Cities program, as the department was awarded a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to help us structure and design the EIB. It was the first in the nation to be publicly offered. And it opened up a new source of funding to implement sort of a critical mass of these types of resilience and restoration projects that wouldn't otherwise be funding, they wouldn't be priorities for funding within our department CIP, which is supported by water and sewer revenue. But these projects have important environmental and social outcomes, improved quality of life, and the EIB issuance was tied to the value of all of these other benefits. And it was marketed to investors who were interested in these outcomes. And then also the project performance and accountability were baked into the model. So the performance metric that we are using to evaluate the success is the volume, the aggregated volume of stormwater captured by all of these projects we'll be installing. Because for one, since this can be sort of applied to all of the projects, and because this metric, this reduction in runoff contributes directly to water quality and flooding, which are two of our primary goals and two monetizable benefits of the projects. So to give you some examples of the types of green infrastructure projects that will be funded by the EIB, we're going to, with those, they'll consist of green infrastructure bioretention features such as rain gardens and bioswales in a couple of city parks. We'll be installing stormwater planters in the right-of-way in a flood-prone neighborhood to capture runoff from streets and sidewalks. We'll be putting in constructed wetlands to capture and clean stormwater, another frequent area of frequent flooding, which will also provide a community amenity. And then doing a couple of stream and floodplain restoration projects. The picture on the bottom right is the current condition of one of the project sites, where you can see a degraded stream in a concrete channel overcome by kudzu and ivy. And so we'll be restoring the natural stream channel, removing the concrete, reconnecting it to the floodplain for flood storage and peak flow reduction for large storms, as well as frequent storms. And then also restoring the habitat and replacing all of the invasive species with native species, creating a community green space here. Now, all of these EIB projects will provide some flood volume reduction through the capture of stormwater. The stream restoration projects specifically will improve flood transport by reconnecting the streams to the floodplain. And then we have projects in the combined sewer area that will provide capacity relief to the combined system. So the direct and indirect costs of flood damages are significant, in addition to structural losses, flood insurance claims. This nuisance flooding in these areas has many secondary economic impacts on the community. Health impacts, lost work productivity if people can't get to work. So it is challenging to quantify all the benefits of flood reduction that are directly attributable to these projects, but they are building resilience and reducing risk and liability to both the city and the department. And some examples of avoided costs. You can see we just doing using the FEMA model, estimated flood damages to buildings in the floodplain associated with our projects are about $5.7 million. And then we've had extensive flooding in Proctor Creek in the past, has caused the city to buy out flood damaged properties. In the case of Cook Park, that's a park that's under construction where there's going to be a large stormwater retention pond. The current value of all those properties that the city brought out is 5.9 million. So those are a couple of sort of anecdotal examples of some of the avoided costs from flood reduction to the city. So furthermore, all the EIB projects will benefit surface water quality by detaining and infiltrating the runoff. So we were able to estimate pollutant removal by all of the EIB projects related to suspended solids, TSS, phosphorus, nitrogen, and bacteria. These water quality benefits both help our department meet permit requirements and represent avoided costs of the department of cleaning, sediment removal, and downstream stormwater infrastructure, and pumping and treating polluted stormwater. So a value could be applied to these avoided costs for the purposes of the outcomes valuation and financial model used to structure the EIB, which Ben will talk to a little further.
Yeah, great. So as Amanda alluded to, we took some of these projections on flooding and water quality in particular, and we're able to value the degree to which the projects that were planned could actually mitigate those impacts, and what amount of avoided costs could be generated. And so this economic valuation was then fed into that performance payment structure and the actual financing of it in order to set the terms of, well, how much is an additional gallon of stormwater captured worth, and at what thresholds of stormwater volume are we setting these additional payments. And so that's the work that's necessary as part of any impact bonds. This is the value of these outcomes, as well as additional non-volume linked outcomes at the expected level of stormwater volume capture. And you see here the flood mitigation number may look pretty low, but we took a pretty conservative approach when modeling this to assess what is the share of these avoided cost benefits directly to the department and to the city government. So we weren't looking at the overall expected avoided property damage or economic damage from flooding. We're looking at what is sort of the government share of that benefit, since they are the payer or the issuer of this bond, and their payment is linked to these outcomes. And also just wanted to note that there's, in these projects, and is often the case in a lot of our work, there's a host of other outcomes that we may not be able to put a number on or put an economic value on, or maybe a little bit more indirect from the primary entity or issuer or payer of these bonds, which in this case was the Atlanta Department of Watershed Management. So again, this economic valuation is based on the expected level of stormwater volume capture, but the next slide shows that there's a high degree of uncertainty around that economic valuation, depending on the amount of stormwater volume that could actually be managed and captured by these projects. So because there's that uncertainty around how successful these projects are going to be in capturing stormwater, we threw this into this performance-based financing model where higher volume capture is linked to higher economic value, and therefore a share of that is paid out to investors in compensation for a lower base case. And moving beyond this project, I mentioned we're doing work in a few other environmental issue areas and other geographic contexts. One of them has been working with the Environmental Defense Fund and the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority in the state of Louisiana, looking at using this kind of EIB outcomes-based financing for wetland restoration projects around the coast. And there we're also using these projections on climate impacts and climate costs to come up with a financing structure that incorporates the potential for avoiding those costs. And the graph that you're looking at here shows this is not even accounting for the actual benefits of coastal wetlands in terms of mitigating storm surge or mitigating nuisance flooding. But here you're looking at just the case that even to build the projects themselves, the longer that they wait, the more subsidence and sea level rise there will be. Therefore, it actually costs more to do the projects if you're just waiting for piecemeal funding to do the wetland restoration. Whereas, issuing a large financing vehicle to really scale up wetland restoration all at once and then be able to pay it back over time, you're avoiding future costs even just for the construction of the projects themselves. And then a final example in the next slide is we just started a new project in Southwest Colorado, looking at using this kind of financing to support forest health and fuels reduction treatments in some of the forested areas around the San Juan National Forest to reduce the risk of wildfire as well as some downstream water impacts. And this is just an example of some of the data that we would use to be able to value those outcomes. So with that, I'll wrap up and hand it back over to Christiana.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to all of our presenters. We really enjoyed all those presentations, and we got a number of questions from members of the audience. So I'm gonna start off with a couple clarifying questions that came in. And the first one is for Jeff, and it's about calculating the costs or I guess the losses. And the question is, did you add up the loss of real estate and structures per se, or also the total loss of the property and the loss of property taxes?
Sorry, so so structures, so this is structures as well as the land. It's not looking at loss of property taxes. So yeah, from a sort of fiscal perspective, it's it's sort of missing that, but it is certainly true that this will have major fiscal impacts, which I think Ben and Amanda's presentations did a good job of getting at. So that is something else to sort of consider. And yeah, this is just adding up, so value of both structure and land that'll be flooded.
Great. Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense in terms of a real estate focus versus a more municipal or state focus. Thanks. And then the other clarifying question that we got is I think for Ben, and it's about whether savings or revenue are being measured or captured to repay the EIB bonds, and if there's a different, or EIBs, if there's a different structure for if you're basing that on savings versus revenue.
I would say that the structure doesn't necessarily depend on where that revenue source is coming from or in terms of what type of source it is. But for some of our projects, we're working with structures where there are multiple beneficiaries or multiple jurisdictions coming together, a municipality and a county government, for example, and the structure and the outcomes-based financing or the outcomes-based performance payment mechanism may depend on where those funds are coming from and who are we attributing the benefits and that value to. So I would say that the structure overall doesn't necessarily depend on avoided costs versus revenues. But that said, I think working with governments that are maybe not as forward-looking as Atlanta, it's obviously if you're able to tie new revenues, that is more compelling than avoided costs. And so we also try to look at those benefits where we can. So an example of that is also in the workforce development aspects of this model that we built. which took into account, what are the new income tax revenues from having more people sustainably employed.
Yeah, thank you. So another question that is primarily for Jeff, but then others might want to weigh in. You had mentioned that the risk assessments that you presented are lower bounds because of continued development of houses and property in risky areas. But the question notes that in Norfolk, in Norfolk, Virginia, there's a large decrease in property values in flood zones and in flood-prone areas. So the question is, have you noticed that trend anywhere else? Is that happening anywhere, or is Norfolk is it an outlier in terms of that loss of value in riskier areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, sort of getting at this idea that the market will start to reflect the heightened risks of flooding. So that's a great point about Norfolk, that a lot of these low-lying neighborhoods there are already, are already starting to see sort of diminished demand, and therefore some of that value starting to kind of disappear through that market mechanism. We've been sort of surprised at just how little these long-range forecasts are figuring into people's calculations right now. It was a really striking fact about some of the rebuilding after some hurricanes, and I think so. It's so far it seems like, especially for homeowners, so for sort of owner-occupied housing, people are not looking that far out, and the bigger place that we are seeing it is a bit more in commercial and apartment construction and financing. Those folks seem to, maybe just because they're used to considering the capitalization of income from a rental property over a long time frame, they're starting to shy away from some of these investments and pay a little closer attention than the folks mainly looking at homes from an owner-occupied perspective.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, we definitely hear that to some extent in terms of long-term infrastructure investments and other investments in areas that are risky that really have longer project lives or longer uses. I didn't. Do any of the other presenters have any thoughts on that that question about some risky properties losing value versus that trend not being that widespread? Okay. So a few other questions. I think this is also for Ben and for Amanda. Are the EIB costs for a city higher than traditional bonds, given the increased difficulty in quantifying and guaranteeing the impacts?
Yeah, I would say that they can be. In this case, we were subsidized by the Rockefeller Foundation through our partnership with them and with 100 Resilient Cities. But in general, this is a novel form of financing, and as such, there's still transaction costs. But as we're seeing more and more cities use this kind of financing, we're doing another one for green infrastructure in Baltimore. We just started another one in Hampton, Virginia. I think we're going to see some of those transaction costs come down as we get smarter on how to do cost-efficient evaluation methodologies, and as some of the legal infrastructure and the legal opinions around the performance payment mechanism becomes more mainstream.
Yeah, I think I could just add to that to echo some of what had been said. Yes, there were higher costs to putting this particular bond together because of its novelty. But being one of the first, we did have the benefit of the grant, and so that and with that, I mean, we really worked to try and put together a model that could be replicated both by our city, our department, our city, to some degree, or others. You know, trying to provide that model to lower costs and make this more replicable and mainstream. And also, there is the cost of the evaluation of the projects, and that is wrapped into the total bond amount.
I'll just add one more thing on that too, is that, you know, we don't think this kind of financing is appropriate for every project, and it's really suited to projects that are using nature-based solutions where there's some uncertainty around how they're going to actually function, or projects that are otherwise innovative and a new way to approach stormwater management, for example, as opposed to installing another underground tunnel that may not produce the same kinds of local or co-benefits that green infrastructure does. And so we wouldn't say that you can use this for traditional infrastructure that already benefits from traditional financing approaches, but where there's some uncertainty around how these projects are actually going to perform, or for projects like these that were lowered down in the priority list and lacked access for that funding. This is a way to really center the financing around those impacts, and it can be more capital efficient depending on how well the projects actually perform. So you're hedging that risk, and there's a trade-off there between risk and reward.
And then a similar question that kind of builds on that theme of looking for the right projects for an EIB. One of the questions is about how the EIB approach seems to have been often used for larger cities and all the examples that have been given. And if there is any opportunity for that to be used more for smaller municipalities, and if it's just more that it's being piloted in these larger cities, or if it's really only appropriate for these larger cities.
No, I think this approach is beneficial to a number of different kinds of cities. I think we've gotten some traction with some of the larger cities at first, just because so the first one that we structured, which was the first impact bonds in the environmental space, this was a type of financing that came from the social impact sector, was with the DC Water and Sewer Authority. And I think following that, you know, we've gotten attention from the 100 Resilient Cities Network and from some of these larger water departments and utilities. But we're also doing a lot of work with smaller municipalities or in rural areas, and who face similar issues and face those same capital spending and decisions and cost optimization decisions, and thinking about some of these upstream and downstream impacts as well. And one other kink in this structure is that there are other projects we're working on, again, where there's 2 or more entities that are all sort of sharing in the cost of the project, with the understanding that, you know, any one entity on its own may not be able to fully support financially these projects, but by crowding in other entities, it can be a way to help share some of those financing costs and have them repay based on the benefits that they get. So an example is some of the coastal work we're doing in Louisiana, where we're, you know, talking to private industry, a lot of the large oil and gas companies who also benefit from coastal wetland restoration to mitigate risk to their infrastructure along the coast. And they're interested in sharing in those financing costs and repaying based on the benefits, because, you know, they also understand what the impacts of sea level rise and nuisance flooding and storm surge is on them. So it can be a way to bring multiple entities to the party as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that thorough answer. So for our next question, I think let's try to go back to the costs that were discussed in the National Climate Assessment. So Brenda, why is it that global emissions reductions can reduce risks more for the labor sector and in extreme heat mortality than we saw for the coastal property damages?
Thank you. That's a very important dynamic because of the way heat trapping gases increase in the atmosphere. The primary response is global surface temperature warming, and that directly affects extreme heat mortality, and a lot of the labor costs, reduced labor hours in this assessment. It takes a lot longer for melting and shrinking the land ice that contributes to sea level rise, as well as it's 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with the ocean. So as you warm up the surface area above it, it takes a while to heat it up, and when it heats up, it expands. Therefore, if there's a lot of inertia, once you warm up the ocean, it's going to continue to expand. So we have that legacy of past emissions playing into the sea level rise over this century. So emissions reductions get you 20% reduction in coastal property damages. However, if you want to reduce it further, you really have to invest heavily in some of the solutions of adaptation that were mentioned during this very informative webinar.
Right, and those estimates of coastal damages that you had presented assumed no adaptation, right?
So essentially, it is priced in 2015 dollars, and it assumes some population change over time, but most of it is the case without any additional adaptation, because that way you could have apples to apples comparison across this multi-sectoral economic analysis across all these sectors. And therefore, that's why adaptation can reduce the damages and risks even further.
Right. Thank you. That makes sense. And then, Jeff, for the property losses that you had presented, that also assumes, does that assume any adaptation action in those different areas?
Nope. This is essentially trying to give a baseline of what will happen without adaptation, and I mean it's also assuming no further development, right? So it's just adding up what's there right now. So yeah, there's sort of increasing risks as more development happens in the coast, and certainly potential then to mitigate that with adaptation.
Thanks. And then I have another question for you. Do you know how communities are addressing low-income repetitive loss properties in areas that are not enrolled in the FEMA flood insurance program?
I do not have great detail on the policies of what communities are doing under those circumstances. You said low-income households with repetitive losses in due to flooding. I do not know exactly what's happening at the local level for that.
This is Amanda. I will say that I think repetitive losses is really a term under the National Flood Insurance Program administered by FEMA, and I know, Atlanta participates in that, and so it doesn't get exactly to the question, but we have been implementing the mitigation grant, and we've been working, with FEMA and through their hazard mitigation grant program to try to slowly use that funding to take mitigation actions in the repetitive loss properties, but they have to be enrolled in the flood insurance program in order to qualify for that funding.
Yeah, thank you for jumping in there. Amanda, you had mentioned that your department in the city of Atlanta is trying to is trying to prioritize areas that are low income or less privileged. And how have you been able to work that into your process of prioritizing areas, or was that really just a priority that came through in selecting specific projects for the EIB funds?
Well, our current mayor, our current administration in the city of Atlanta puts an extremely high priority on equity, everything that the city does. Our department does as well, and our commissioner. Our department is, right now, serves as, we're one of 6 municipal utilities nationwide on the U.S. Water Alliance's Water Equity Task Force. And so it's members of our department along with community leaders, and we're specifically looking at how our water projects and investments impact the communities in many different ways, and how we can be providing additional benefits, not just from the projects themselves, but co-benefits. One of those in particular is our workforce development efforts, which we are really getting off the ground in this department, and we are actually using the EIB as a pilot for that initiative. So it's kind of second layer on top of our primary performance metric, as I mentioned before, is stormwater capture, which can be tied to, which is what's tied to the bond repayment and the financial analysis. But secondarily, we are working with the community, with the sort of stakeholders and residents of these neighborhoods who who are very focused on job creation and training opportunities, and with local workforce organizations to figure out how we can really require local training in green infrastructure installation and maintenance associated with these projects in particular in the Proctor Creek neighborhoods. And then, that is kind of a pilot to continue to grow this program for our department and the city, and tie community benefits to our contracts.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we still have some questions coming in. For the Atlanta EIB, really just stormwater flow was used as the main measure of benefits or returns. Have other projects used other metrics, and are there ways to use multiple metrics within one EIB to really add some more dimension to determining the returns on those investments?
Yeah, I would say that our approach and our work is really dependent on the projects and the geography, and we start with trying to understand from the issuer or payer's perspective what are the outcomes and what are the metrics that are most meaningful to the issuer, and the economic analysis that we do is tied to that. Which benefits have the most amount of value, and what are the goals of the projects. It's also informed by, in this case where there are multiple projects, what are common metrics that are that can be used for each of these projects, and what are those common themes. As far as structures go, where there's multiple metrics, as part of trying to bring down some of the transaction costs that have historically been associated with impact bond, particularly social impact bond financing, we still try to stay with structures that are relatively simple and that are recognizable by the broader capital markets and by traditional fixed income investors. And so, the more metrics that you add, the more bells and whistles that you put on, the more complicated it gets, and the more expensive potentially it can get to issue it that way. However, one of the places we see this kind of financing going is potentially through a fund where there are payments made for a suite of projects that are made based on a few different outcome metrics. So it hasn't been done yet, but we could foresee that coming.
Great, thank you. So in the Economist survey that Jeff presented, we saw that a lot of the responses were no answer, and also, as Jeff acknowledged, a number of the proposed solutions would maybe be unpopular or difficult to implement. So are there other thoughts on how to really address that sea level rise risk to property and to people that integrate some of those economic forces, but also are just more feasible? And I think anyone can jump in on this.
Well, to kick it off, yeah, I think that a lot of the emphasis is on trying to get things right moving forward. So to the extent that people live in areas today that will be at risk, it's totally understandable that they would be, you know, they probably like where they live. They have family and roots there, and so it's just asking them to relocate is understandably just difficult and maybe not even the best way to approach it. But to the extent that we can sort of moving forward either require for new construction or new homeowners coming in that they do have a sort of full insurance for the true risk of flooding, that could go a long way. I think that part of the challenge there is that imposing these new like to the extent people do want to sell and move away current residents, if we require the people buying to have really strong, have what would potentially be very expensive insurance on those homes, that will reduce the resale value of those homes. That'll make it harder to sell. So I think those are situations where buyouts might just be the simplest option if you're unable to find a buyer under a new sort of strict regime of required insurance. It may end up being cost effective for the government to buy out that property, and then if it's just in an area that's truly at pretty imminent higher risk. And so if there's sort of forces and policies in place to stop the increase in number of folks at risk, and then a lot of people will living there today could be moving out sort of through attrition over time of just eventually for other reasons they may want to move, and the government could buy them out. That's another way to go about it. And since a lot of these projections, I was talking about 2100, that does give us some breathing room in terms of just letting the policies play out over time. It's not like getting everyone out of the way of a hurricane that's going to flood every home that somehow we know is happening next year, and we need to get everyone out today. So in some sense, time can help us there. I'd be curious though to hear from other folks more involved with the policy side, what they think.
Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Brenda, did any of that come up with any of the coastal adaptation research that that was in the National Climate Assessment, at least that you were involved with, acknowledging that there were many other chapters and lots of other research?
Right. Essentially, the main take home is that without severe investment on the scale of the pace of climate change that we are risking, that we would have, you can only get so far with adaptation. In other words, the main issue is that there's going to be policies that financially homes would be at risk and be financially underwater, as we say, long before you physically are underwater through inundation of the seas. What ends up happening too is that because of the extremely damaging hurricanes and cyclones and then wildfire risks that are happening, those end up being devastating to communities way earlier, and we already are experiencing that and already are bankrupting the disaster relief fund. So we already are at the stage where the current policies are not even being able to protect people or get them back on their feet and help with resilience with this 1 degree C world. So serious policy incentives, private incentives, leadership through insurance, reinsurance, and so forth, which is really exciting to see some of the examples here for the Atlanta case and the Zillow research and so forth, that these types of signals can be sent earlier through every year you're renewing your insurance, and signals can be sent through that mechanism. So I would say that the other investment that's going on, if you invest in infrastructure that is not resilient or is infrastructure that adds to the pace of emissions to heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, that also are, those are types of investments that can only accelerate the current pace of change.
Right. Right. That's definitely a benefit of the green infrastructure that Amanda and Ben are working on in Atlanta. So I'm going to, we're just about ready to wrap up. Yeah, thank you for that last answer, Brenda, because that really ties it together. Mitigation action is what makes adaptation action more effective, and so that helps these projects in Atlanta, and that helps these coastal areas affected in Zillow's research, and we're all really trying to work on both ends of that climate issue to reduce and avoid these costs. So we post our recordings of these webinars usually in 24 hours. You can find them on our website on the event tab, or we also have a C2AS YouTube channel. And then if you really enjoyed this webinar and are really interested in this topic, C2AS is hosting our annual conference next week in Baltimore, Maryland, our Climate Leadership Conference. We have 3 tracks, and one of them is focused on resilience, and you can still register through the end of the week. So if you want to spend 3 days thinking about this kind of stuff, we'd welcome you to that event, and we look forward to seeing you there. But for today, thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to everyone that joined us. This was a really wonderful webinar, and I'm really glad that everyone could make it. So everyone, have a nice rest of your day.